All right, welcome to video number 16. This one is on sustainable cities, which is chapter 22 in the textbook. And we'll kind of walk through different parts of cities and kind of the migration from rural areas to the urban areas that we see in today's world. So a couple definitions to know right off the bat: urban versus rural area. And so it's by the amount of people per set geographic area that they live in. An urban area would be something that we have more than 2,500 people per square mile. And we typically talk about this as the town or the city plus the suburbs. The cities, of course, are going to rely on resources coming in from the outside of the city to make sure they run fine. Rural area is less than 2,500 people per square mile, and these are going to be like our farming lands or our national parks, stuff like that. Some urbanization and urban growth. So there's been kind of a general trend of people moving towards urban areas, and we've got what are called push factors and pull factors. A push factor is anything that moves people away from an area, right? Moves out, forces them out. And then the pull, of course, would be something that pulls them into, or an attractive feature of the new area that kind of draws them there. So the reason why people are leaving rural areas is there are less services, right? If you live in a rural area, you might be driving really far for the grocery store. You might have limited mail delivery, things like that. Stuff's not as easily accessible to you. You might have fewer choices for church denomination. So things like that are one of the reasons. One of them is lack of job opportunities, right? So as we bring more technology into agriculture, it requires less people to work a farm. If you've got a machine that can milk 50 cows in one session, that's eliminating a lot of potential jobs for people to have. And so if you don't have jobs in the rural areas, well, you go to the cities, follow the jobs. All these are other reasons why people could be pushed out of the rural areas. In some countries, wars is one of them. If you're in the rural area and a war breaks out, you're not very well protected. You might kind of be out on your own. And so the city would offer some sort of protection. Other pull factors for cities, the biggest one here is the job opportunities. A lot of people are going to move in due to economic possibilities. It may not necessarily be that there are more jobs, but it appears that way. And then there's a couple host of them here, but the big one here is the job opportunities. So that's the main reason why they're growing. You also have a natural increase due to births, right? So if you got more people living in the city, that's more potential parents, which means more kids, which means larger city populations. Some general trends. We've gone from 2% of the people living in cities in the 1950s to today's number. This would be 2007, if I remember. So not quite today's number, but close to today's number of 45%. So that's a huge percentage of the world's population that has moved from rural areas into urban areas in the last 50 years or so. It's predicted to go as high as 66% by the year 2050. So all of these people living in a small area has some positives and some negatives, and the goal of this PowerPoint video here is to kind of cover some of that. So urbanization. We've got some really big cities today. There are some huge cities. In fact, 400 of them have a population of more than 1 million people. We also break them up, the really large ones, into mega cities and hyper cities. It's tough to get a picture. This here is Lagos. This is in Nigeria. But it's a huge city, over 20 million. I think Lagos is the largest city on earth, at least the time that I made this PowerPoint it was. I think it was something like 34 million people in Lagos at the time. All right, that's an awful lot of people living in a city, and it presents a lot of issues with it. Currently, 38% of the people live in these cities, the more than 1 million. So that's a really high number. What's the United States look like? So developed countries versus developing. It's a lot slower in developed. It's slower in the developed countries, partly because we already have a lot of people there, right? So these, kind of thinking back to demographic transition model, these developed countries have already had a big migration into the cities. And so we're starting really high, right? We're starting here between 50 and, or is that 5 and 6 billion people here, versus our developing countries, which is a much lower percent urban population. Here's what I should be looking at: urban population percent. It's steadily rising up, but it's not as sharp of an increase as the developing countries go. One of the reasons why the developing countries are shifting towards urban is poverty, right? The poverty is pushing people into the urban areas. And so you end up with these slums and shanty towns. A Google image search here can produce some pretty despair-filled, kind of depressing pictures of these towns, the conditions people live in. People are living without access to clean water. They may have to walk a while for a stream that has sewage running into it. No poor or no electricity, limited education opportunities. And this is talking about Mexico City here, right? So we've got people sleeping on the streets. It's not a pretty picture in some of these really impoverished areas of these mega cities or hyper cities. This is quite a larger picture of that graph, and so you can see just how much the percentages are changing. I think one of the nicest parts here are the blue and the green boxes to show the difference. You can see the developed countries, the blue, have stayed relatively equal amounts of people in them, right? This is about roughly 1 billion people living in them, versus the green, which are starting out, the developing countries in the 1950s, have less than 500 million, and that line is just skyrocketing up to where we're looking at by 2050 over 5 billion people in the urban areas. This is a picture here, so we're going to talk a little more about Mexico City. It's found right here at the bottom part of Mexico, right in the center. So Mexico City, second largest city on the Western Hemisphere. There are some larger ones over on the Eastern Hemisphere in India and Nigeria. But so it's got 18 million people in it. And so some of the problems that it poses is some severe air pollution. And it's due to the heat island effect, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. But this air pollution is really severe. They've got a lot of cars in a small area. It's located in a valley. And so essentially, you've got these mountains on either side of the city. And because the city is mostly blacktop, it gets very hot. And so that air rises up. And then as it goes over, we also have to have cool air coming in, and so it just kind of recycles like this. This is kind of the heat island effect in 15 seconds. Other problems there, we've got really high unemployment, so you've got a lot of people in poverty there, people without really any marketable skills, and so there's no jobs for them because they don't have anything they bring to the table, and so they just kind of sit around, which leads to a high crime rate. Because if you can't get a job, you're going to have to turn to some illegal way, and so you have kidnappings and muggings and drug trade, and a really huge portion is crime here. The slums are really terrible in Mexico City. We have no running water. The sewer system exists, but it's running down into the water supply. The electricity is spotty. You've got really high infection rates, so it's not a pretty place to be, especially if you're in one of the slums. The United States has the following trend. So in the United States, people kind of came to the Northeast. Let me see. Here's the United States freehanding it. People land here in the Northeast, and we kind of spread out. Eventually, we run out of area here, and so we kind of spread southward. And after we've spread southward, then we shifted west across the United States. And so there has been kind of this urban sprawl in the United States where the cities are not so tightly packed as we see in others, like with slums and really cramped urban housing. Part of the reason is we've got really cheap land. Another big portion or big part of the reason is the low-cost gasoline to encourage car use. And so the car companies really pushed to have these cities built further apart, because then people are reliant on vehicles in order to get to work or to get to school or to get from one house to the next house. And so by building the cities further apart, the car companies are ensuring that we have to have cars. And to this day, we rely on cars, especially here in Jacksonville, where if you don't have a car, you're going to have an awfully tough time getting to the grocery store and getting to work and getting to church and all the other places you may try to get. There's a couple other reasons here, but a lot of it is due to this cheap land and cheap gasoline. Here you can see a nice little graph. So if we look back to 1900, we have about 60% of the people living in rural areas, 40% living in urban areas. And you can see just how much that has switched by 2010 standards. We have a complete reversal. People have migrated from the rural areas into the cities. This graph kind of looks like the Sprint or the T-Mobile coverage maps. And actually what we're showing here is 75% of the U.S. population. So the orange shaded area covers 75% of the United States population. The white unshaded area is the rest, right? The other 25%. And so 3% of the land is occupied by 75% of the people. Very uneven distribution. What that essentially means is that resources, right, food, water, etc., from this area needs to be brought in to support these high density zones. I've got a nice big green area here. We need to bring some food to Jacksonville. That's probably where it is grown. And so those resources have to be brought in. Likewise, the waste that the cities produce have to be brought back out. And so we have to figure out some way to send them back. Whether it's just air pollution naturally distributing, or whether it's water resources being pumped in and out, if we're talking about LA. All right, let's keep going on then. So urban sprawl, part of it's due to that growth of low density housing. We're talking United States still here. So like I said earlier, land was pretty cheaply available. One thing the United States has a lot of, and it's land. And early times, and even today, land around the cities is pretty cheap, especially as you get further and further away from the city hub. And the government aided some of that with these kind of beneficial loans for new single-family homes. Part of that is to drive the economy, right? We're trying to push this into people buying things. And what's a better way to get people to buy things than give them a home to live in? Right now you got to buy stuff to put in your house, and all of that is going to push that capitalism forward a step. So it benefits everybody for these cheaper homes to be available. The state funding of highways, kind of the story between the highways being built was after World War II, Eisenhower wanted to drive the army cross country to kind of show off to everybody, like, look how awesome we are. We spent all this money on defense and we kicked their butts. Check out all the cool stuff we have and we can do. The sad truth is they barely made it across the country because there were no highways then. And so some of the parts, especially in the Rocky Mountains, were really difficult to traverse, especially with a large group like the Army. And so he said, we need to start building these highways. And so we did. And now they're easily connected. And so you can get city to city fairly simply. And that is going to help people move into cities, knowing that you could get back out or get to your family in another city pretty easily. Gasoline, I think I touched on that one already, and some other examples here. If you want to pause the video and read them, feel free. So cities are broken up kind of in two or a couple different ways. We're going to cover this one in the next one. I think I'll do a small video 17 to cover these. This one's getting about as long as I want them to be. So please come to class tomorrow with some sort of questions or notes, and be prepared to discuss this video. There's a lot of stuff. I went really fast, so let's look at some of the important parts and pull a little bit more detail out of them. Thank you for watching.